12. I don't know how many. Maybe we should do job talk bingo, right? Find out how many. I've got 16. Go for that one. But that's now over, so we can actually get back to doing the programming that we actually like to do. So it's a real pleasure to have Jonas here. Many people at Brown already know him because he was a postdoc here between 2014 and 2016. University of Cambridge undergraduate, Cambridge man, very solid, very good, excellent. Worked with Helen Thompson, and then went to MIT and worked up at MIT with none other than Ed Seinfeld and also Suzanne Berger. So someone who's floated amongst the networks that we're all part of. I've always liked Jonas's work because he's someone who's a real political economist who's always taken, if we used to call it, the green stuff seriously. And as that has become more and more mainstream and more important, he's become an increasingly important voice in that regard. His 2021 book, which is going to share some parts of that today and some further reflections, was the winner of the best book in international political economy from the ISA in 2023, and in 2022 the best book in science, technology and politics from the APSA. So I don't think it gets any better than that. Without any further ado, welcome back to Brown. I look forward to hearing the talk.
Thank you for this very nice introduction. I think the last time I spoke in this room was a practice job talk at the end of the postdoc period, so sort of it brings back memories, and I've survived, so that's, I think, the important lesson here. All right, so I'm going to talk about my book, which came out late last year, and I think has only gotten more relevant since, because sort of the world around green industrial policy and clean energy has changed, particularly in the US. And so sort of my plan for this talk is to not talk for too long, but to kind of briefly lay out the outcome that I observe in the book and explain sort of this global division of labor and clean energy industries, offer an explanation for it, and then run through the German and the Chinese case as sort of two illustrations of this, and then maybe open up for a broader discussion on sort of economic decoupling and climate policy in this new era of kind of mercantilist trade policy that we're about to enter. And so maybe I'll start with things that happened after the book was published. But this summer, the president signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which may or may not reduce inflation. But it's not really primarily about that, it seems. It's, at the core kind of a very ambitious opening move and kind of redefining what the American economy might be about and what sort of American government intervention might be about. And it's at least an attempt to launch a process of catch-up development, if you will, in which the US tries to catch up with China in these industries that are currently so dominated by China. And also dominated by Europe, at least more than the US is currently engaged in. And so it's an industrial policy bill, most of all, that contains a lot of local content requirements to try to bring these industries here. And so the book that I'm about to talk about is not really about whether the US will be successful at that project, though I'm happy to offer sort of speculation on that afterwards. But it is a book about why the US ended up in a niche of this global division of labor that has left a lot of people sort of unsatisfied, if you will. And so it's a strength in the United States of invention, but not so much of actually commercializing and manufacturing the stuff. And I think the kind of developments at the moment are very much response to that. And so the US has been wrestling with these issues for quite a while politically. And so the answer to why the US ended up where it did in many ways starts in China. And so I don't think we can really understand sort of the US role in these industries today without understanding kind of what China did and where China came from in these sectors. When I started working on this project over 10 years ago at this point, which is sort of embarrassing to say, but I wanted to understand why China was moving so rapidly into these industries and kind of dominating these new industrial sectors. In the US at the time, the Obama administration was in power, and Obama had sort of just declared that this was a big clean energy race against China, that China was winning and the US needed to kind of engage in more seriously. And at the time, it very much seemed like China was winning. Solyndra, I think some of you are probably too young to remember these things, but there was this big solar firm that went bankrupt with a lot of government money in the US, and it just seemed like our attempts to win that race here weren't going very well. And I think in Germany, too, there were high-profile solar manufacturers that had gone out of business at the time, and I think the discussion surrounding that was really also a discussion about the broader viability of the German economy in sort of this global economy that was dominated by China in many ways. So could you be a high-wage manufacturing nation in these supply chains in which China was taking up more and more market share? And so when I started going to China and actually sort of spending time on the shop floor and interviewing firms, I was surprised that this wasn't really about a race between these different places, but actually a lot of collaboration between manufacturers from each of these economies and a lot of sort of on-the-ground work together between engineers from these three different places. And so China's firms were indeed very kind of competitive in a sense and focused on the kind of innovation and R&D required to bring these new technologies to mass markets and make them cheaper and faster to manufacture. But they did that often on production equipment that they bought from German firms and tweaked with them. They used materials developed in the US. And so this wasn't just a China sort of story in a way. And so one of the companies, JA Solar, which I sort of talk about in the opening of the book, had just released a kind of new high-efficiency solar cell at the time, but it really was developed in collaboration with a German production equipment manufacturer, and one of the key ingredients, a silicon ink, was coming out of an NREL collaboration with a Silicon Valley startup. So it was really sort of a very global story. And so instead of sort of thinking about going head-to-head, what I observed were kind of three very different engagements with these industries. What I call customization in Germany, so a focus on automation, production equipment, complex components for these industries in firms that are fairly small, often family-owned. In China, what I call innovative manufacturing is a term that Ed and I came up with in a collaboration many years ago, but sort of a focus on commercialization and scale-up to mass production, so the kinds of innovation you need to change product design so you can make them better and faster. And then in the US, kind of a focus on invention and really a focus on startups that were spinning off from research institutes such as this one, and without very many production capabilities, but sort of great strength in coming up with the next generation technology. And this sort of division of labor was surprising in many ways. And in one way, these three countries, for all their differences, were using very similar industrial policy tools. They had all converged essentially on subsidizing markets for clean energy technologies and funding R&D for clean energy technologies in some way or another, and oftentimes had actually copied these tools from one another. So the Chinese renewable energy law was basically like a translation of the German renewable energy law. So there was sort of tight collaboration in that sense. And I think there was a political logic behind that convergence because these investments required so much public money. Governments were sort of trying to use tools that would bring some of the economic benefits back domestically as well. So politically, it was hard to justify subsidizing wind and solar if you didn't also could point at least to the ambition of building manufacturing plants that would actually employ people, whether that worked or not. And so what started as open-ended kind of investments in exploration and new technologies after the oil shocks and sort of the possibility of moving away from fossil fuels, at some point then became real industrial policy goals about building manufacturing plants and sort of creating an industry around this. And so as a result of these different kinds of policies, we had this sort of rapid growth and investment in these industries globally, including in developing economies. So this wasn't just a story about sort of rich countries, but very different responses from firms in these three countries, which I sort of use really to talk about a broader division of labor. There are other countries involved here. It wasn't just a division between those three, but those are the ones that I cover in the book. And I think this sort of development of this division of labor where these places were working together very, very tightly, but using, in many ways, skills that were very typical for these countries was also surprising because these are post-globalization industries. So if you think about sort of a reorganization of the global economy in the 1990s, China joining the WTO in the early 2000s, these industries became mature after all of that happened. And so if you thought that there might be a break with what countries had been doing previously, this would have been the industries to observe it. But instead, countries kind of entered these new sectors with very traditional skills, but in new industrial sectors. And so firms replicated kind of traditional strength in these industries, and a lot of the new technologies, these are no longer new technologies, we've now on to different ones, but the sort of logic in many ways remains, came to market as a result of very tight linkages between the firms. And so the question that I ask in the book and that I'm trying to answer here today is why firms picked these distinct specializations in the global economy, even though they were supported by very similar industrial policies in these places, and pick these different specializations in defiance of policy goals that in many ways had the hope that you would get entire industrial sectors into the US and into Germany and into China. So everyone wanted to do everything, but only got a share. And so the argument that I make in the book is that globalization itself in many ways caused this divergence of in different industrial skills and sort of different profiles in these industries. And the logic behind that is that globalization created new opportunities for differentiation, because firms could collaborate with one another and sort of engage in a division of labor. They could focus on much sort of more narrow industrial specializations, and they could basically revive these existing skills and sort of build on existing industrial capabilities even in these new sectors, but that was because they could collaborate and they didn't have to do everything at home. And so that really changed sort of how firms engaged with domestic institutions and responded to the industrial policies that governments set out to them. And so before I launch into that in a little bit more detail, I think it's good to kind of step back and think about what we actually sort of mean by globalization. I think there's very different terms floating around, different social science departments. One view of globalization, and maybe that's sort of an economist view, although they would probably butcher me for saying it that way, but it's really sort of thinking about globalization as a process of reaping gains from trade and engagement in the international economy, and kind of a process of progressive outsourcing in that way. And so the question here is maybe the one that the Obama administration was concerned with at the time. Would firms just outsource more and more of their activities to China in this race to the point where sort of even these core strength and innovation in the US would be undermined? On the political science side, there's been kind of a different concern regarding globalization, and I think here it's often sort of seen as a process of kind of convergence that makes kind of distinct domestic political economies increasingly difficult to maintain. And so the competitive pressures coming out of the global economy mean that we have sort of regulatory convergence and maybe institutions are falling apart. And so that was really the German worry at the time, kind of age-old vocational training institutions, sort of a kind of ancient financial system of small banks. Would these kinds of things be sustainable and allow Germany to kind of, prosper in this new world? When I talk to people on the shop floor, and so I did hundreds of interviews in kind of factories, hard hat tours with engineers, and sort of asking them, what are you doing, who are you working with, and what do you rely on? To them, globalization really was something very different. It was the ability to collaborate with others, right? So going to Chinese industrial parks and running into engineers from all over the world that were also working with these firms. And so that's kind of the perspective that I bring to this book, where I see globalization as also a process that has opened these new pathways for collaboration. And so I don't think these different kind of views are mutually exclusive, but they certainly highlight different elements of this dynamic. And so So I use in the book this term collaborative advantage, building on this idea of globalization as collaboration. And what I really mean by that is that firms derive two sets of benefits from engaging in the global economy in this particular way. And so the first is that because the global economy suddenly allowed firms to collaborate in new and different ways, they could participate in this division of labor that that allowed them to kind of specialize. And in many ways, that's kind of the economic manifestation of this argument. So they no longer have to do everything. They can focus on a set of skills and then collaborate with others, including the Chinese solar manufacturer and the German production equipment manufacturers. And so collaboration in that sense obviates the need to establish all the skills required to invent a new technology and then bring it all the way to market, right? And so that's very different from sort of the Ford conglomerate that owned the rubber plant to make the tires and all of the different parts that you had in the process. And then the second kind of element of this is because you can specialize, there are different pathways for getting into these new sectors, right? You don't have to figure out the entire solar industry to become a part of it or the entire battery industry to become a part of it. And so firms were able to pick particular skills that worked with existing knowledge that they had and that could build on existing domestic institutions and then collaborate with other firms to sort of get the kinds of skills that they didn't have in-house. And so the German firms could enter wind and solar with specializations that worked well with the kind of existing political economy, precisely the political economy that many were worried would go away sort of in this new competition with China. And instead it was sort of the collaboration with China that allowed these firms to strengthen these institutions and keep them alive. And so it's precisely the institutions that many were worried about would be threatened by these processes that sort of became critical for firms. And so the short version of the argument essentially is that you have these new opportunities for collaboration. It allows firms to specialize. Because they can specialize, they can work with these existing domestic institutions and sort of strengthen them rather than having to reinvent what they've been doing. And so an example of this, for instance, is this auto manufacturer, sort of auto supplier, German firm, family-owned, entered the solar industry sort of based on existing knowledge and automation, and then added some new skills that they had adopted from the medical industry, sort of certain kind of laser drilling for making production equipment for solar. But they did that in collaboration with Chinese firms, and so it was that collaboration with China that allowed them to redevelop these skills and also kind of engage the vocational training institutions and the German financial institutions that helped them. One of my last trips before COVID was to go to see this firm and see if they were still alive, and they had just built a new plant and were now making sort of parts for electric vehicle engines, so they had kind of reinvented themselves once again. And so instead of undermining these traditional domestic political economies, globalization allowed firms to kind of strengthen and reinvest in them. There's sort of a big literature on kind of comparative capitalisms that I want to kind of skip over here. But I guess the sort of short takeaway is that it's quite opposite of a race, and sort of the political rhetoric that was coming out of governments at the time. It was because of this collaboration that it wasn't a race, that these firms sort of enabled this differentiation and strengthened it over time. So that was a little bit of an abstract discussion. So let's sort of get into some of these cases and actually talk through what happened with kind of real names attached. I'll talk briefly about China and Germany to do this, but I'm happy to talk about the US. I usually get most of the Q&A with American questions, so we can kind of get this stuff out of the way and then talk about the US afterwards. And so the argument I'm making here really is that sort of, China's rise enabled Germany to remain more German than it would have otherwise have been. And I think people often forget that in the early 2000s, Germany was really not doing well. It's had this sort of very long economic boom since that's now, sort of being undermined by more recent developments. But back then, there had been a long economic crisis. There was high unemployment, a lot of perception that the country had basically become uncompetitive, and that these sort of institutions and the way of doing business was no longer really relevant in this new global system. For instance, the kind of vocational training system, or these sort of house banks that were able to lend but only small sums, and so on. And so the story I tell in the German chapter, which I've now mentioned a few times, is that they basically existing firms from other sectors entered wind and solar by kind of reinventing their skills in customization in the making of production equipment, which didn't exist for solar and wind at the time, sort of off-the-shelf production equipment, and doing that very much by repurposing and strengthening kind of domestic economic institutions. And they did that in response to these kinds of technology push and market pull policies that existed in China and Germany as well. But it was a different set of firms that responded to these new opportunities in Germany. And it was mostly these small and medium-sized businesses, many of them family-owned. Most of them were making production equipment and sort of highly customized components. They weren't able to run large production runs because they had 500 people and a lot of it was manual labor. And so they might license off the technology once they sort of had exceeded what they could do in-house, but they also themselves weren't interested in becoming mass manufacturers because, you know, in these small towns where they were, that wasn't really sort of a possibility. And so they would do a gearbox for a wind turbine and sort of do the prototype and then tweak with the manufacturer the first 50 gearboxes or so. That's what they could do, but they weren't interested in making 200,000 gearboxes for the global industry. And so those were the firms that were really dominant in Germany in these industries and were sort of often missed by public conversations. There's a lot of headlines about solar manufacturers going bust, but this part of the industry actually was doing the vast majority of employment and actually sort of business activity as well. And so maybe another example, one of the firms that I really love this one because it sort of shows this so creative spirit, I guess, over time, how firms look like they're still the same firm, but they're actually doing very different things. So these guys started in the 1800s as a foundry and then sort of got into making saws, and then from making saws got into making manufacturing equipment for furniture, and then eventually got into the sort of semiconductor space when that became a thing. And then kind of reinvented themselves to start making solar PV equipment. They started exporting to China in the early 2000s, so the very beginning of the Chinese solar industry, and then developed a bunch of new technologies together with Chinese partners and sort of became a big player in making the production equipment for ever new generations of solar technology. And so from kind of these early starts, they're still in the same town. It all looks very sort of similar, but they're obviously in very different industries and in different places. And so they didn't do that alone. They did that with these partnerships and sort of tight collaborations with China. Chinese firms, in many ways, kind of complemented the German manufacturers. They were focused on mass productions. The Germans were focused on these smaller production runs. China was one of the first places to automate, and so the demand for this automation equipment from Germany was very clearly coming from China. Labor turnover was so high in Chinese factories that you couldn't keep up with training, and so there was a lot of need for automation. And so they were also the first to kind of apply these technologies at scale. And so what you saw over time is sort of a rapid increase in exports from Germany to China, and actually a trade surplus in these industries for a long time with China as a result of this sort of collaboration. And so interviewing firms and asking them what kind of institutions they were using, what was important to them in doing this transition and getting into these industries, it was a lot of the very traditional stuff. They needed the kind of skilled manufacturing labor. There is no R&D department. The shop floor is the R&D, and that was still true in these sectors. They also didn't need a ton of money, but they needed very patient money and people who would trust them that if they spent $4 million reinventing themselves for a new industry, it would somehow work out. And so this sort of financial sector that many thought was very limiting was actually also very supportive of this particular process that these firms had embarked on. And so the other side of this is sort of China's rise, which, if Germany is worried about losing manufacturing, I think China at the time was starting to try to get out of manufacturing. And there was a lot of push both to be more technologically independent and focus more on innovation, but also not do sort of low-end manufacturing for places. But what we got, and so it's, concerns about the middle income trap and all that sort of stuff started to kind of appear during that time. How do you grow past manufacturing with an economy of that size? But what I found in China is that firms actually very much wanted to stay in manufacturing and relied on kind of local government institutions that supported mass production. And so they started innovating and kind of building R&D teams around manufacturing. One of the sort of stories that that I think is sort of illustrative of this is they were able to build kind of what they called golden lines, entire manufacturing plants that were just for R&D. The German engineers always sort of got a little teary-eyed talking about it, because in Germany you had to kind of compete with production, right? They had to shut down the plant for the weekend so that you could run some experiments. And then China was like the paradise because they had these incredible plants that were just focused on this particular thing. And so they built on these legacies of mass production to kind of push into innovation in these sectors, but in a way that didn't compete with the kind of new tech coming out of the US or the sort of customization coming from Germany. The central government in China very much wanted that direct competition. So there was a focus on indigenous innovation. There was this thing called the Made in China 2025 initiative. So kind of a host of different government initiatives to try to make China less dependent on innovation coming from elsewhere. But local firms turned around and said, okay, this is great, we'll take your R&D money, but we'll spend it in a way that doesn't actually compete with these foreign partners, but sort of helps us fill this particular niche that nobody else had filled. And that was this kind of focus on manufacturing R&D that I call kind of innovative manufacturing here. And in some ways, I think it made sense, right? Because in global supply chains, you were able to license technology, you buy technology. There's a lot of talk about sort of China doing this illegally, but there are engineering firms in Europe that will design you a wind turbine for a fee, and you know, lots of kind of licensing agreements with places elsewhere. So actually sort of very legal ways of doing this collaboration. What no one could teach them was how to do mass production. So this is the early 2000s. We haven't really used these technologies at scale. If you drive from Los Angeles to Palm Springs, which I recommend because it's a beautiful drive. There's this sort of crazy dinosaur museum on the side of the road, and then past it you enter this valley, and there are thousands of wind turbines, but there are also thousands of burned out wind turbines kind of on the side of the road. And so in the late 1990s, this was a very experimental industry still. I mean, people were sort of tinkering in their garage with these technologies. And so no one had actually kind of brought it to scale in this kind of modern, very professionalized way. And so I think that was the niche that the Chinese firms saw in these sectors. And so what they did is enter kind of long-term collaborations with firms elsewhere, and get, in this case, this 863 program used to give out money for applied research for Chinese firms. So every year you could apply, and it said, like, you can get money if you develop a wind turbine that has this capacity, and then the next year it would go up a little bit. The idea was that you would sort of make it your own and not work with foreign partners, but they all entered these kind of licensing agreements with other partners abroad, in this case from Germany, eventually sort of signed joint development agreements, took a stake in the German company, but this kind of division of labor remained. The R&D money was repurposed a little bit. The Chinese side was focused on figuring out how to take that German technology and then sort of bust it up and bring it to scale. And that was sort of tolerated by the central government as long as there were kind of Chinese brand names on the final product that was shipping. And in that process, they repurposed a lot of manufacturing institutions. I'm happy to kind of talk about the logic behind that, but basically local governments in China are highly incentivized on GDP growth, and so investing in long-term manufacturing to them, innovation makes no sense because innovation often fails. If you invest in manufacturing, you get sort of a short-term bang for your buck. And so they had lots of support for mass production, including in these industries that weren't really getting a lot of support elsewhere. And so one of the key, I think, innovations in China wasn't so much that they were getting preferential interest rates for bank loans, for instance, but that there was a financial sector that was willing to lend the kind of money that you needed to build these huge manufacturing plants on which you could then develop the kind of innovative skills that you needed. And you see this at different periods in time. This is just sort of going through annual reports from some of the big solar manufacturers. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, they were able to raise huge amounts of money and expand manufacturing capacity at a time when basically financing had dried up everywhere else. And there simply was no one willing to lend $2 billion to a German or an American solar manufacturer to build something elsewhere. And that, I don't think, really has changed so much. So they sort of repurposed these local institutions, including this financial sector, focused on manufacturing. And so what we got instead, as a result, rather, is this very rapid decline of the cost of these technology, which is now upending kind of energy markets and politics and all of these things now, sort of all of a sudden. But it's been coming for a long time, and it's not just a Chinese story. It's also a story of, inventions coming out of Silicon Valley and, production equipment from northern Italy, and so many people had kind of something to do with this. And so if this is the result of the kind of collaboration that I've been pitching throughout this talk, so things have changed a little bit. It's a lot less popular kind of as an idea. Where does this leave us now? And so I've argued that these sort of different specializations are only doable because of collaboration, that you need this kind of collaboration actually to take advantage of your different strengths in a way. And what we're seeing now is perhaps a situation where globalization itself needs to be sort of protected, or at least the parts that need to be protected to support this kind of collaboration. We've had growing tensions in the US-China relationship now for quite a while. The Ukraine war has sort of accelerated these concerns about reliance on global supply chain, and sort of a lot more conversation about risk. And weaponized interdependence, I guess, now has become like a household term globally. So a term that these guys came up with. And so there is this new focus on self-sufficiency and a new sense of also crisis for places like Germany. There are huge debates about what to do about China, how to kind of engage China, and the German chancellor just sort of basically said we can't pull away from China. That's like economically suicidal, and has been criticized for that a lot. But these kinds of stories also tell why this is really difficult for them to do, because it's kind of the basis of the entire existing system. And in the US, we also have a very heavy push for decoupling, right? And so the IRA is not just an industrial policy bill, but it's also a pretty strong kind of anti-China move, right? There are local content requirements there to get tax credits for wind, solar, and batteries. If your electric car has any kind of raw materials in it from China, you can't get any of these tax credits. And so there's a hope here that will be enough to kind of bring these supply chains here. But I'm a bit skeptical that it can be done, or at least that it can be done on that time frame, precisely because of the story. And you sort of see that what was really underlying the development of these places in the first place was sort of amplifying existing strength, and you'd have to reinvent all of that domestically in order to do this successfully. And I don't think this is just an academic question, especially in these industries, because it's now a question sort of about the ability of governments to shape national specialization. But what that means really in the end is that climate industries have benefited enormously from this collaboration, and sort of pulling away in these industries might delay us. It might make these technologies more expensive. And the question is whether we have time to wait for domestic battery plants to come up. We need to start using this stuff. We have to peak emissions very quickly. And so there's real world repercussions from getting this right as we shift out of this division of labor, or at least sort of move the needle a bit and kind of get started on doing other things. And so this book is about wind and solar because those were this kind of established clean energy sectors, but I've now been following this in other industries in this space. So in the battery industry, we see a very similar dynamic kind of playing out now, and also kind of a very heavy reliance on China. And so the question is sort of what do we do about that? And one thing maybe that I will leave you with sort of as a suggestion for how to kind of deal with this kind of going forward and be more realistic about it is maybe one of being a little bit more measured in our collaboration, being more realistic about how long it takes us to develop alternatives, but in the meantime, for the sake of climate, also to continue these kinds of collaborations that we can't yet replace. And I think politically, it's unreasonable to expect the US to spend huge amounts of money to restructure the domestic energy economy if all of those products are coming from abroad. I don't think that's realistic. It's also unrealistic to me to expect in this world to suddenly do everything domestically. And I think politically we're sort of going from one to the other without real nuance there. And so maybe increasing the domestic share and learning how to make some of these things domestically would be very helpful. But it might take us some time. And ironically, it might rely on learning from China in many ways, in ways that I don't know if we're kind of really ready for politically. And so I'll leave you with that thought, and then
by all means, just field your own Q&A.
Okay. Thank you. Nick, yeah.
Maybe we should take students before faculty. Up to you.
No, that'll never happen. You have to get it started.
Okay, so, fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. It's reminiscent of many earlier iterations of high-tech politics and cooperation. Semiconductors is one that I think of, where something fairly similar happened between the United States and Japan. And it became evident that even as Japanese producers, especially of commodity memory chips, where production expertise was a competitive advantage of Japanese firms, and they began to excel, U.S. firms were not particularly good at this learning, which you ended by saying might be part of what's so important now. But I wondered what you think is happening on the Chinese side. Will the same kind of competitive advantage in large but innovative manufacturing remain in China? And will those Chinese organizations show the same adaptive capabilities to remain in current and succeeding waves of sectoral change as the German Mittelstand did? This ability to move almost existing business models from one sector to another sector seems critical to this argument. And we know that the German Mittelstand has often been able to do this. If we can generalize about the United States at all, it's often new entrepreneurial firms that come into new industries, not older incumbent firms adapting. And what do you think will happen in China? Can these super innovative mass manufacturers remain in business, or will the whole Chinese economy become a big game of real estate?
Well, the real estate thing, I think, is over. I think the government's very actively trying to deflate that right now, which is reflected in their sort of abysmal growth numbers. But I think it's a good question. I think the area where I have the most concerns is sort of in that field we're observing sort of how this actually happened on the ground and how much exchange there was between these different groups, right? So you'd have, in this in the development for the Silicon Inc., for instance, that I mentioned earlier, this was a Silicon Valley startup, got NREL funding. They almost ran out of money, sort of, didn't really know how to get this, wanted to become a solar manufacturer. They then worked with the Chinese solar manufacturer to turn that into a product. And the Chinese manufacturer then had a big advantage because they were the first to bring this about. But that meant that, American engineers were on site in China for years trying to do this together. And so I think this kind of collaboration, regardless of all of these other institutional problems that exist, that is really breaking down now, right? And in return, some of the European manufacturers also wanted to see how the scale-up was happening in China, because that would help them design the next generation of production equipment in Europe. And so if you have to go through 2 weeks of quarantine every time you go, this entire system sort of can't continue in that way, right? So I think there's a lot of sand in that, in those wheels. But we do see China doing the same thing in other sectors. So I think the battery one is a similar case. And it's in part, I think, driven because Chinese institutions sort of reward that system still. We still haven't gotten an alternative performance evaluation for government officials that isn't 80% reliant on GDP. And so this temptation to do kind of Chinese industrial policy of throwing tons of money from state development banks at these sectors and then hoping that the best firms can sort of be winnowed out and win in that system. And so that these sort of structural incentives to at least keep trying this model, I think, exist. And I haven't done as much interviewing, obviously, as I would have wanted. I was in China until the lockdown and then sort of left just before, like the weekend before, and haven't been able to go back since. But it seems like, at least talking to the German firms, that as much as they can, these collaborations have sort of persisted through that time, and there hasn't really been an alternative model yet. But it's it's a good question. And for the climate part, I hope they can kind of bring this to all sorts of other areas. But that may not be the case in practice.
Great talk, super interesting. I guess I want to ask about the connection between the final part and the preceding parts of the argument. So you pivot to decoupling, and maybe we'll talk much more about that. But I'm curious, like, why you think that collaborative advantage was so politically precarious, ultimately. Like, it's not immediately clear from a political economy standpoint why an economic arrangement that's mutually beneficial to its parties, like, doesn't create enduring political coalitions to support it. Maybe that's just an artifact of you focusing more on the economic side than like I saw in your chart that there's a political institutional kind of complement to this, but it seems that a very crude story would be that ultimately there weren't the domestic political coalitions, especially in the US and Europe, maybe most especially in the US, I'll put Europe aside, to support this ongoing collaboration, which was beneficial, which had like mutual benefits transnationally, but maybe generated conflict, inequalities, X, Y, and Z domestically, right? And so you have this kind of disarticulation between collaboration at a transnational scale between firms and maybe class and political conflict domestically, right? And so at some point, and the financial crisis is obviously a key inflection point, right, for that sort of coming undone. But I'm just wondering, like, in maybe counterfactual, like, what would have been necessary for it to be more politically enduring, and or like what do you think resulted in what reads as a very rosy story kind of in your account of like transnational cooperation across cultures and geography, like ultimately giving away to kind of deep political conflict, distrust, and new Cold War, X, Y, and Z.
Thanks for coming in, and thanks for such a good question. I think the American case is especially interesting. I mean, historically, the U.S. has been the largest investor in R&D in these sectors, right? And a lot of that investment has always been justified with domestic economic outcomes. Like, we are solving kind of market failures in research, and then that will trickle down into the economy. And I think the sort of discrepancy between the political promises and justifications of that kind of spending, and then the result that, the reorganization of the global economy now means that those firms not necessarily kind of invest in domestic, commercialization and production here anymore. I think that became very visible over time. And so there was a sort of tension in that system that was there all along, but got stronger over time. And I think all places kind of promised a lot more than they could do. There was a lot of hope that industrial policy would get firms to do, all of these different things, the manufacturing, the invention, the deployment domestically. And I think the US got kind of the smallest industrial footprint of these different countries. In Germany, I think there was a lot of concern about these big solar manufacturers. They also weren't super happy about it. But these Mittelstand firms are incredibly well politically sort of, established and connected and could lobby on part of the stuff. So they had a different, they could point to some successes, at least in these sectors. And in the US, that was very, the sort of discrepancy, I think, was very, very obvious. And so that's certainly part of the problem. We now have the IRA trying to kind of fix that, but we're fixing that by just sort of throwing tax credits at people with some requirements without fixing some of the institutions that we need to kind of replicate that, right? And one of the proposals last summer that was kind of written into the reconciliation bill and then written back out was this IFCUS proposal, which I wrote a little white paper with Jeff's help here at Watson. Was one attempt to kind of create a development bank that was funded by the US government and would fund exactly this kind of manufacturing work. That would have been a starting point to sort of not just ask firms to do more, but also really kind of fix some of the institutional holes that have prevented that from realizing. But we, obviously didn't get one. I think we got a lot of loan authority for DOE, and that might go some way towards fixing this, but it's not quite the same. So, yeah. I think you.
So you talked about how politically this like the competition between different manufacturers is framed as a competition, but then economically it works better as collaboration. And so I was wondering if in your interviews with firms and workers in these 3 different countries, if they shared your thought that it's economic collaboration, or if they still thought of their firm as competing with other foreign firms. Just if there was any discrepancies in what the workers thought, and also if that would affect like domestic industrial policy, like if their public opinion would affect the development of more domestic industry or not?
I think it's a bit both. I mean, it's not like there's no competition in these sectors, right? Each of these firms are competing with lots of firms that are trying to do the same thing. And especially in China, the kind of competition between these different manufacturers is very fierce. They're very thin margins. Some of them went bankrupt. And so you have to kind of be good at the innovation part in order to survive. So there is lots of competition. I think that what I saw often, though, is that when governments came out with these industrial policies that said, okay, now we're basically nationalizing the solar industry and we're becoming technologically independent, firms would sort of nod and publicly play along, and then basically made zero attempts to change this sort of nature, because it would mean that they have to kind of get really good at something that's very easily available from somebody else, and they all have limited resources and sort of have to prioritize what do we do. And so if you're competing on manufacturing in China and the margins are thin and other people are investing in R&D that would help them become a better manufacturer, why at that time would you take resources away from that to then also become a Silicon Valley startup somewhere in your company and kind of come up with new invention? And so I think the collaboration was sort of intrinsic to the business model in a sense that, that they ignored a lot of the sort of government intentions. And specialization is somewhat self-reinforcing, right? Like if everyone's doing everything and they're sort of okay at it, that's one thing. If people start focusing on particular elements and then get really good at those elements, you basically have to also be super focused on those elements in order to compete, or else sort of as a mediocre kind of generalist, you're not going to be able to survive. Here and then.
I guess I had a question about the comparison between the political incentives of the centralized government in China and the economic incentives or the local political incentives of the districts in China as well. It seems like evidently the political incentives of the centralized government are to make this a competitive investment. And specifically like what you were saying, like R&D competition, the inventive R&D competing with the US so that now China can have inventions themselves and stop relying on the US. And clearly that's not really what the money of the subsidies was used for. It was more like the productive R&D rather than inventive R&D. And so given that, like, seems like there's a difference in incentives between the central government and the firms and the local governments. Why does the central government just say, okay, we're fine with you using it that way, even though it seems to be a misuse of the funds, or at least going towards separate goals to what was originally intended?
I mean, I could talk about this for 4 hours at a minimum, but one of the really interesting things, sort of the short version, is that governments in China, that China doesn't have one government. I think we always sort of assume it's this monolithic actor, but actually there's very different layers and lots of sort of different, provincial governments, municipal governments, and they all have very different incentives. And so the central government is basically looking long term. What can we do to sort of push past manufacturing, increase living standards further, and they have sort of a much more kind of strategic long-term perspective. But local governments are incentivized by what's happening next year when they come up for promotion, and so you have a very kind of divergent set of realities for officials kind of operating in these different places. And so I think the center wants to keep pushing, hoping that the others will eventually follow. But some of the structural incentives at the local level haven't been changed, in part because the localities don't want it to change. There have been all these sort of experiments with trying to bring in green GDP as a measure instead of the existing GDP measures. The localities don't want that stuff, right? Because they figured out how to do well in the existing system, and so they also don't want to sort of uproot everything. And so, if you open the paper and there's like these headlines that China is the biggest polluter in the world, but also the biggest manufacturer of this clean stuff, usually the story behind it is that basically different folks are involved with very different incentives, and we all call them the Chinese government and are then surprised that they're sort of acting very differently. And so I think that's sort of the case here as well. Yes, Jeff?
This is just great. The book is terrific. I'm so glad to see it get the attention that it's now getting. It's definitely richly deserved. You tell the story in this, maybe matching your personality, in this incredibly positive way, right? It's collaboration, there's advantage, there's all these nice things. But I wonder whether there is a story here that is much darker, that this is the betrayal of the American working class, right? That the system of higher education and private sector innovation in this country has extracted resources and given them to owners of intellectual property that was then allowed by various public policy failures or incentives to then sell that intellectual property or ship it overseas and move all of the benefits overseas. And not only to overseas, but of course, the corporate owners would get it here. And so the story that you tell, I think, is about sort of America being able to stay America and Germany being able to stay Germany because of this process. But I wonder if there's a time horizon attached to this. So
Yes.
I don't dispute it, but it might be something that we can do for a certain amount of time, but ultimately we're mortgaging our future by doing it in this way, where we've pushed all of the sort of innovative manufacturing to another country, which is massively benefiting from it, and we lost this huge opportunity. And so in a sense, the Inflation Reduction Act is a reaction to this as like, oh gosh, we've lost this game and we need to get back into it, and it's trying to make up for lost time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. I think a lot of the structural changes here sort of happened before this book, right? And so the structural changes sort of preceded these industries, and that's why maybe I don't cover them as clearly. Josh Whitford wrote a really amazing book many years ago about sort of Wisconsin manufacturing and kind of the death really of these sort of small and medium-sized suppliers. And basically his argument is that the big OEMs in the US, so like the General Motors and like the GEs, were pushing more and more of the design work into the supply chain. And there were not enough sort of institutions to support these suppliers to do it, so they couldn't keep up. And so then these big firms started sourcing from elsewhere, and so that then kind of hollowed out the domestic manufacturing industry. And if I talk to the German firms about sort of who used to be your competition, these machine tool firms all had, there were a competitive sector in Ohio and in Michigan and in Wisconsin that was really hollowed out. And then when the firms died, the vocational training institutions died, the banks kind of all merged and merged and merged. So now we have like 2 or 3 banks, and they obviously get much higher returns investing in Tinder than in maybe not Twitter, but like Tinder for now, and then the manufacturing. And so when these new industries kind of appeared, there were fewer firms in the US that could take advantage of it because we had lost these skills almost prior to the development of these sectors. And so I think you're exactly right that this is sort of also a really sad story, and the US basically wasn't able to take advantage of these investments. And so I think the IRA is is super important, and I sort of support the mission of it. I think from this book and kind of talking how firms engage with these broader supportive institutions, I think it's just not enough. Like it's a set of goals and money to meet those goals. And so in some ways it borrows from what kind of the Korean developmental state did in the 1970s by benchmarking, and then you get rewarded if you meet the benchmarks and that sort of stuff. But Korea also had all sorts of institutions to help firms get to those benchmarks, and we've somehow not done that. We also don't have an opportunity really to adjust the benchmarks because we've passed that bill by locking Manchin in the basement for 2 weeks and then just barely got it through. So we can't kind of open it up next year and say, okay, so maybe the local content should be 38%, not 42%, right? And so I think it's a really good project, and it's important for climate policy in America. I mean, I hope we do get lots of plans, and I hope they're all in Republican states so that you can make an economic argument for why this needs to be done and maintained. And there are also obviously sort of, all sorts of other sort of problematic developments in China that might mean we want to maybe sort of shift some of this stuff elsewhere. So I think I see it very similar. I think my positive spin is less my personality than me kind of looking at these cost decline figures and saying, okay, it actually now makes sense in most of the world to invest in solar and batteries over building a new gas or coal plant. And so, we have to be around as a planet to kind of figure out the next step. And I think that collaboration really helped in getting us there. But I do think that this sort of we just innovate here and manufacture somewhere else is politically unsustainable. And it's a big reason why climate policy has been so volatile in this country, because there's never been like an industrial coalition to support it. And particularly manufacturing has this incredible political clout in this country because everyone associates it with 1950s union jobs and, you know, sort of a good living wage. And so we're looking for that, but we haven't actually ever gotten that manufacturing industry really quite in the same way in these sectors to support climate policy.
Just super quickly, I mean, following on Thea's point, her question about sort of maintaining that domestic political coalition, it does strike me that, yes, it's great that we brought the cost curves of wind and solar down, but at a huge price in terms of maintaining a political coalition. And so when we're thinking about the next set of technologies, whether it's EV batteries or hydrogen or what have you, maintaining that political coalition has to be on our radar screen, or we do it again, right? We mortgage our future again.
Right, and that's why I think the IRA in many ways is such a sea change in thinking about climate policy in this country, and also about research about climate policy. I mean, it's been sort of about public attitudes and measuring what people feel about this stuff, and sort of, you know, then trying to tax it. I mean, that was, you know, carbon tax is the way to go. It's sort of a hard thing to market to people as a positive thing. I mean, no one's ever liked a new tax. And so now this, you know, we're not even talking about emissions anymore. We're talking about plants and jobs. I think that will help build that. I still think we're not going to make the 40% local content requirement for battery materials by January because it would take someone building 17 lithium mining plants between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Like, it's unlikely to happen at this point, right? And so, huh?
I'm going to build 3.
Yeah. With your research funds. Yeah.
So here's a thought.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Dan sent me a piece that just came out in Nature, which is very interesting. It basically compares, if you like, kind of a global optima of global collaboration and decarbonisation versus a whole series of simulations at subnational levels of varying degrees. And what that suggests is that we get a little bit too focused on scale. That scale is planetary, and that's the only way to do it, and if you don't do that, somehow it's going to fail. But would it be so bad if essentially you had China doing whatever they wanted to do and then trading with whoever they wanted to trade with, the EU basically investing everything it can into sort of green industries and doing its space, and then America reluctantly coming off carbon eventually and doing what it does, even if it means a whole bunch of imports? At least going by the simulations, it's the second best, but the efficiency loss is in the order of 5%. And if you're trading 5% sort of outcome efficiency for 50% more political chance of it happening, then maybe it's not so bad. Maybe we need to actually change our focus, in a sense, away from the global towards the more regional is actually the place to act on.
Yeah.
In which case, what Jeff's worrying about is America's problem, right? Definitely, but a solvable problem for America, rather than something that has to be then scaled up as a kind of part of a global moving, you know, set of different issues. So just a thought on that.
Right, but we're also in a very different world now, right? Like in 2005, global solar markets were a fraction. So if you wanted to get to scale, you couldn't get to scale in 16 different economies because the market just wasn't big enough to do that, right? And so we learned how to do scale in one place, and that was probably the only way to get here. But as we now switch everything to solar and wind and batteries and storage, we can probably achieve scale in lots of other places. And I think in many ways that's also why China might not be so concerned about local content requirements in the US, because, you know, if the pie keeps growing at that rate, you can do better even as other people do better. And I think people can be a little bit generous about it. And so I think that might be a good path forward. Didn't mean to skip over you.
No, that's all right. I have a question that's not really a fair one, and I think maybe you can answer it in 3 or 4 hours yourself. But the elephant in the room for me here is Africa and COP that's happening in Egypt right now. And I'm just curious if the dynamics and processes that you've been looking at for your book, I'm wondering how do you see it playing out in the African development economies, which I think literature sort of presents as the Chinese development playing field for the past few years, and then if there's anything along these lines that you see happening in COP that's interesting, that's caught your attention.
I've missed a lot of COP, so I don't want to give sort of, I'm not sure I'm the right person to talk about that, but I have been thinking a little bit about Africa, and the way that I've been thinking about it is looking at the global supply chains for these industries and thinking, okay, so if we shift some production from China, where could it go, right? If all these places want to decouple, but we also know how much of these things we need to produce to meet 2030 goals, where are there existing capabilities that would allow us to scale the stuff up? And in all of those calculations, the only way that developing economies really feature, maybe outside of a few exceptions in East Asia, is through very extractive industries without really a clear path to get out of that into more value-added manufacturing and sort of, use it as a developmental pathway. And I also don't think that that is politically sustainable. We can't just be kind of mining, cobalt in the Congo and then not give them anything else, no pathway to sort of become the producer of something that they could sell for a lot more money, and expect them to still support the overall process in the long run. And so the Belt and Road Initiative for the past 10 years or so has been in many ways the only game in town in terms of kind of overseas energy finance, and not with the green tilt. I mean, some green stuff, but also lots of not green stuff. And I think there's a real opportunity to think about what could Europe and the US do together as we're sort of questioning this current setup and shifting some of these things to make sure that it's not just extractive sort of industries that end up in the global south, and that we can sort of tie, you have to build the coalition not just domestically but also globally, and I think that's where a lot of work needs to be done. And you see at COP sort of the big conflict is, who's going to pay for mitigation and adaptation in these places, and sort of no one wants to be on the line to kind of be responsible for covering those skyrocketing costs, but I think that's a really important one to figure out.
I have one more. Yeah,
Okay.
Thanks very much for the presentation. It's really interesting to see the dynamics of collaborative advantage. My question was about your conclusions and the relationship to the rest of your presentation. You mentioned at the end that governments, in light of this new protectionism, etc., would need to be more realistic about what's manageable, what are the limits of domestic capabilities. And then I noticed in other parts of your presentation that there clearly seemed to have been like a big failure of perception, that governments didn't really understand collaborative advantage, but it rather happened kind of very bottom up, right? Through these interactions of different types of innovations. So I'm wondering, given this kind of, what to me seemed like a failure of perception, what are the tools that governments can maybe develop to actually be more realistic about these own capacities, and kind of to understand perhaps the potential of collaborative advantage better? Because in terms of like climate policy, I see here perhaps a risk that the new policies, more protectionist policies, are undermining the dynamics that enable these decreases in renewable energy prices. So I'm interested in like what sort of tools, maybe there are some sort of information or knowledge tools governments can develop to deal with this. And of course, in addition to reading your book, I think that's probably a good starting point for that. Yeah, thanks.
I mean, some of it is really actually sort of marketing of achievements, right? I think in the United States, it's really interesting how there is always this focus on manufacturing in these sectors. If you go to a Chinese manufacturing plant for solar, like hardly anyone works there. If you go to a battery manufacturing plant, a lot of the stuff is in dry rooms where you can only be in there for 15 minutes because your skin starts peeling off. And so you kind of have this highly automated process with the few people kind of going in. I mean, it looks like a nuclear plant, right? So this is not the kind of mass production, mass employment, middle class creator that people are talking about here. The reason why we talk about it is because we sort of have it as the sort of the stand-in for all these other things that we want. But we have a huge service industry around these sectors domestically. And if we want better coalitions, we can also maybe make those jobs better and give them more attention and sort of, not see them as a failure, but actually something that that can bring us forward, right? And so in Rhode Island, it might be the harbor that is hosting the ships to maintain the offshore wind turbines and the guy making lunch for the people who work in the, I mean, there are economies around this, and I don't think they've gotten a lot of political attention. And so, I also think that for sort of security and stability reasons, it would be better to diversify some of these supply chains. But in the meantime, there's also a better job that we can just do about kind of recognizing what we have. And if we're not satisfied with the quality of the service sector jobs, then we may try to make those better rather than sort of shifting to an ideal version of a manufacturing job that no longer exists.
We are at time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys for coming.